The only thing that can make waking up this early on a Sunday is exciting intellectual engagement. And that also, I seriously missed this, engaging with people and seeing humans live, looking people in the eye. So I guess it's going to be reiterated every time that this is really, really amazing to be together like this. So Maurits van Bever Donker will be speaking. He's a senior researcher and manager at the SARChI. He'll be talking between problem and critique, Whither the post-colonial. And after that, we will have Q&A, which I will take. You want to kick it off?
Okay. Thank you, Laura. So this is a part of a session on research presentations, which is for work in progress. So I value your input on this paper, which is in a first draft. My title is Between Problem and Critique, Whither the Post-Colonial. I toyed with another title, which instead of Whither would say Q, the Post-Colonial, in a way to acknowledge that this is a paper that emerges out of thinking cadre, and who is sometimes mistaken as a cantankerous garden gnome, but was actually a teddy bear. If I had started with a Q, I would have also got 10 points in Scrabble, which is always worth pointing out. Anyway, let me start. In the midst of the accidental interest of whites, Frans Fanon suggests that there is strictly no black problem. Writing as he does in early 1950s France, this claim is more than a little startling. Of course, anyone who has actually read Fanon rather than merely having threaded the books through their eyeballs knows that he is responding to the liberal impetus to improve the lot of the black man as such, the thrust of late colonialism, whether British or French. Steve Biko, writing a little less than 2 decades later, says the same, more forcefully. There is no black problem. The problem is white racism, and it sits squarely in the lap of white society. Racism here is neither simply an attitude nor only structural. Rather, it is an epistemic formation that, as Premesh Lalu reminds us, enables the post-apartheid South Africa to imbibe the strictures of what Biko calls petty apartheid. This is not simply a question of their time, as if, since formal colonialism has somewhat ended, the world is now post-colonial. Or to state this more pointedly, racism, an accomplice of European colonialism, has an even more powerful accomplice that has been kept in reserve, the disciplinary reason that still seeps through the humanities. As my late friend, interlocutor, and teacher once phrased it, the trouble with dead white men is that some of them are not men, many not white, and an alarming number not even dead. That's the opening line of his book, Culture and Eurocentrism. Oh. The joy of talking while I talk with my hands, but I have to hold one hand in front of my mouth of the microphone, and the other hand has to keep moving the computer, so it's really weird. Anyway, where am I? So where do we go? As my title phrases it, Whither the Post-Colonial? Is there an other heading? Frans Fanon gives us a little more than a clue. He writes, shortly before declaring that there is no black problem, that all I know is that anyone who tries to read in my eyes anything but a perpetual questioning won't see anything, neither gratitude or hatred. Reading in someone else's eyes, a challenge that can only take place in the moment of a face-to-face encounter, which you probably need no reminder, is not necessarily peaceful, reading someone else's perpetual questioning, as someone else who the episteme produces as black. No black problem, but perhaps a black questioning to guide reading. In what follows, I will attempt to sketch out what might be at stake in such a task of reading. Carrying with Fanon a little longer, we know that this reading, which for him includes both the phenomenological and the psychological, results ultimately in a very particular exit. He writes memorably, but the task in this moment of decision is to change science, to leave this Europe which never stops talking of man, yet massacres him at every one of its street corners, at every corner of the world. The particularity here is often glossed or even ignored, as though the text in which Fanon writes would allow a simple bracketing, a valorization of what came before stepping out. Rather, the text would suggest that this Europe is the name for an epistemic formation that massacres man while speaking of the concept at every juncture of its production of the world. The stakes of such a reading, which is not without the risk of a wager, will be read through three interventions, namely those of Achille Mbembe, Nahum Chanda, and Kadri Ismail. In his critique of Black reason, Mbembe positions his intervention in a moment of what he recognizes as destabilization. Europe, in this time, is off-center, geopolitically, perhaps. In fact, this off-centeredness of Europe might, to channel Fanon yet again, only be a mask that keeps us within the script of Fanon's This Europe. Because the role of Blackness in European self-imagination is not being thought, Mbembe suggests, we are nearing a moment of the universalization of what he calls the Black condition. For Mbembe, this condition is in both the first and the last instance, one framed through an economic imperative, that of capital in its various stages. But in this reduction into the waste of extractive life, there is another subtler impetus at play, one that he calls the hopeless attempt to support a failing eye. Of course, this is a failure that marks both European and Black, a wound that cuts both ways, if differently. We could diverge into a consideration of this failure and its attempts at suture, which largely marks European philosophy, at least since Descartes, but certainly since it called itself such after Hegel. And I think, for example, it called the man a silent symbol in Hegel's aesthetics. But this is not the heading of our reading. Mbembe is interested in producing a reading in his critique of Black reason that examines how Black reason structures both the European episteme and the responses to it. If the Black condition is first and foremost an economic effect, and through this extendable to the world at large, able to become a universal condition, it is also an effect that has been produced as a byproduct of the governmentality of modernity. Race, it seems, emerges as a technique of sovereignty. As he says, our critique of modernity will remain incomplete if we fail to grasp that the coming of modernity coincided with the appearance of the principle of race and the latter's slow transformation to the privileged matrix for techniques of domination. This is a principle which works to negate the idea of common humanity, even as it seeks to extend humanity to the common. However, in his quick traversal of the production of the Black man through colonialism, slavery, and the continued need to maintain French rule across an emancipated empire, Mbembe also argues that race, not the principle, but a recognizable difference, comes first, historically. The stampede of Europe in this reading opportunistically seizes race and makes of it a principle of governmentality that is used within France as a pedagogy of discipline and culture. Race, in a sense, marks the example. In the civilizational metaphor of the family, at a material, symbolic, and psychic level, the Black man becomes a child as a state out of which the properly French have matured, and thereby imbuing the French with a liberal impetus of pastiche. This should sound familiar to many of us in the room having dealt with or thought South African apartheid. This obscuring or masking of race through the liberal metaphor of improvements to the careful reader does raise the question. Mbembe has also deployed the Black condition as a metaphor of the objectification through capital, not as a sign of from where the world has come, but now of where it is heading. As Ismail has shown in his reading of Tyler, this potential slide is also always already part of the arsenal of culture, of the metaphor of improvement. The light white could always become a dark white in Tyler's argument. How, though, in Mbembe's argument, does liberalism operate to secure a racial difference while maintaining the broader claim towards emancipation? To be blunt, the French episteme achieves this through relativizing difference. In other words, it does not set aside the fiction of a racial subject or of race in general. Rather, it reifies race inside cultural difference. Every particular has its universal, and every universal, it seems, produces its particulars. In the midst of Mbembe's very quick history, a schematic sketch, if you will, he powerfully places the slave as the image of blackness. He says, in African history, there is then a figure of the commodity that has as its main signifier the family member who was sold or handed over to him in return for goods. This is not just any slave or any African, but that one and those scarred and moved through the Atlantic slave trade. This mode of subjection that Mbembe describes is not, however, unique to the African or Black subject. Subjectivated by way of desire, the figure of the slave as an image of the Black condition emerges again as a metaphor for the subject of neoliberal capitalism. Of course, Black reason, as Mbembe calls it, does not operate to objectify and does not only operate to objectify and marginalize those marked as Black. What precisely is Black, he asks. It is a name that is given, that locates the bearer as always outside, a naming through a master discourse. What start does the identification, I am Black, make? If the weight of this naming is historical, then Mbembe suggests through engaging a series of literary interventions, the self-identification of oneself as Black must carry a futural orientation. It is perhaps, following Césaire and Fanon, to make a very generous reading of Mbembe, a name that comes to us from a people that are not yet, remembering the weight that makes a new name necessary. So if we follow this, there's Black reason as governmentality and there's Black reason as resistance. So we're in that second phase with Mbembe. Mbembe is very clearly writing from his corner of the world, where Black reason, as he puts it, has been instrumentalized towards violence and separation. Here he seeks very briefly to posit a consideration of the aesthetic of the hero. Why, for example, does Fanon spend more than 3/4 of the rating of the earth on psychology and aesthetics, if it is not a critique in itself of violence, he asks. So he considers the aesthetic, the hero, and a process of self-invention. As he puts it, for which rights should Blacks continue to struggle? Everything depends on the locations in which they find themselves, the historical context in which they live, and the objective conditions which they face, all of which immediately draws sympathy and support, and yet begs the questions. Why the capital B for Black? Why the use of the third person pronouns they, which distances the reader? And then finally, why valorize the particularity of context, the specificity of relativized difference, if that is in itself the mechanism of neoliberal governmentality that it has learned from race? The force of these questions indicates to me the extent of the wager. The identification, I am Black, of Césaire or Fanon, always risks the possibility of being returned as a racism. This does not mean that the wager should not be ventured. Rather, one might need to more carefully guard against such a return. in Leon Dimitri Chandler's exquisite reading of the intervention of Du Bois in his X, The Problem of the Negro as a Problem of Thought, such a lesson is ventured. Chandler structures his intervention through the concept of anacrusis, which carries the double valence of striking back as well as a musical technique of borrowing from the last bar to open the first. A technique that should cause the reader to think of Césare's assertion, "I am black," as described by Bember. Quite simply then, in Chandler's narrative, the physical and epistemic beats that produce the Negro, colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, police action, stand your ground laws in the USA, both create what is called the black condition and offer an opening, a possibility of a backbeat that might produce some difference into the repetition. Recalling that Du Bois begins his somewhat autobiographical The Souls of Black Folk with a preposition, between, Chandler argues that, attending to the trembling of the intervention, the simultaneous raising and destabilizing of boundaries that the preposition makes possible, offers a strategy. The preposition resonates conceptually with blackness. As a signifier, blackness requires whiteness to produce its meaning, which leads Chandler to call blackness a project of white purity. Rather, recognizing that blackness in a word is the difference of whiteness allows us to read how the dogmatism in the midst of the Enlightenment, is Chandler's formulation, around measuring and specifying the Negro, his signals are Kant and Hegel, is all actually about the white man. This terrain, to borrow a term from one of these Enlightenment dogmatists, the realm within which a concept carries its force, is what needs to be overturned. The double consciousness that is so readily identified as Du Bois's intervention is not then only about the black man's location in society, how he sees it and is seen in it, but is also about a practice that might destabilize a terrain. To make this argument, Chandler suggests that Du Bois must be read as operating within the moment of a critique of Enlightenment thinking. Specifically, the challenge to the I brought about by a thinking of difference, exemplified by the figures of Saussure, Freud, and Boas. Whereas these three are readily seen as challenging the terrain of Enlightenment rationality, Du Bois, as the difference of that episteme, is bracketed as an African-Americanist. In other words, Du Bois as a black man must deal with social justice, not the structure of the episteme. Difference, a hierarchy of signification that not only differs but also differs. This is a theoretical term that immediately signifies the apparently post-structuralist thought of Jacques Derrida, the Arab Jew who vividly passes as French in order to unsettle the terrain, give it another heading. I'm thinking of the other heading. Right? And runs the risk of Chandler being dismissed as reading Europe through the black man's text. Right? So because he's relying on Derrida, people will say, well, you're reading European philosophy through black people rather than reading black people as black people. We have heard this argument before. It's a critique that echoes the very bracketing that Chandler identifies of Du Bois. However, Chandler is much more careful in his use of Derrida for his intervention, and it should be said that the footnotes of Chandler's text are a wealth of very sharp readings of Derrida. The text is itself a pedagogy. Derrida, in short, gives us a language which is legible as theory due to his place in the episteme, that helps us to more fully understand what Du Bois was already about. This is Chandler's argument. It is in the identification of the color line as the problem of the 20th century that Du Bois places his question of difference. It is not the name of a boundary or border. It is the marker of difference, whereby white wholeness is produced through black fracture. To paraphrase Hegel, if the white man writes history, the black man waits at the doorstep. After Derrida, it seems, Chandler suggests we can read Du Bois differently. He says, it, the color line, pertains to the very way in which the itinerary of the question of the transcendental and the question of being, respectively, are announced within modern thought. And later, while historical in reference, the colour line's value lies in its capacity to stand as the heading of a problem for thought and not, in the final instance, as the name simply given and ready to hand actuality. The importance of this stems from the irony in modern experience. That cycle keeps beating, even though after Althusser, for example, we now recognize that the subject is a non-static, non-essentialized in-between that is only crystallized as a subject in the moment of the hail. In Du Bois's own reflections on his genealogy, Chandler notes, it is apparent that he could have been either white or black, the descendant of a white man and a slave mother. And yet this X, and that's the X, it's the violence of the relationship during slavery that marks his slave mother, right? But it's also the X of the chiasmus, the turning. Anyway, we'll get back to that. And yet this X marks him as hierarchically deficient, a black man. Paying attention to Du Bois's constitution as a subject is not a case of self-reflection, but rather of what Chandler reminds us Spivak calls de-identification, a sort of reflexive account that is precisely a referring of the subject to those structures that mark and organize its active emergence. It is what we might, following her essay on subalternity, refer to as being politically scrupulous. In a similar mode, then, to that of apartheid South Africa, the difference of race functions through recognition in the social, and that recognition is produced socially, inscribed within a cultural frame. One, it would appear, is not equally in between. The difference of the colour line differs and defers, and to this extent, it serves a broader function in society. Was that deep or right?
Yeah, it's fine.
It assuages the anxiety of whiteness. Every statement weighing the black man affirms the white. It is in the figure of the slave who, in a move that resonates with Mbembe's intervention, emerges as an exemplar of the subject produced through the colour line, not just marked by difference, but also deferred from the realm of the fully human. This is a founding violence that underwrites the emergence of the model and is, following the work of Hortense Spillers, disclosed as a denial of the humanity of the slave, premised on the recognition of that very humanity. A structural exorbitance that Spillers defines as ambivalence. The difference of the system, the recognition of race as a simple fact, what Beaker called petty apartheid and Mbembe called relativized difference, is not available as a ground for resistance. According to Chandler, this is because that difference masks the difference of the colour line, the differing of race and the deferment of humanity that is integral to the formation of whiteness. Nonetheless, that difference must be abided by, as he phrases it, and I quote at length. It is with this double implication of the example of the subordinate in general, the African American in specific, and the slave in particular, of subjectivation as arising only in this torsion of a double reference, that a certain sense of possibility can begin to be remarked. The sense of this path of subject constitution, if there is such, as a movement of ambivalence, makes possible in turning a naming of an operation or process moving within the system that exceeds or remains exorbitant to any projection of the historial as a realized structure, and perhaps announces both its possibility and limit. Chandler, in other words, reads Du Bois as inhabiting the episteme against which he writes, through abiding by the colour line as a hinge on which the difference of that episteme turns. And of grammatology is the text in the background for that move that Chandler makes. The wager here is that abiding by difference is a method through which to open a possibility, to cause the system to tremble from within, risks a reduction to reified difference. The limit to this wager, perhaps, lies with reading. Culture and Eurocentrism is a book that rigorously attends to the task of reading. In particular, Kadri Ismail sets out to read the conjunctures, the conceptual edges of difference as they structure what he calls the Anglo-US episteme. In short, to read those corners where this Europe is never done speaking of man while massacring her. This work of reading is passed on to the reader with the invocation of, most frequently, the post-colonial reader, but also the close reader and the reader of deconstruction, and then also the symptomatic reader. Quite clearly, these terms are not synonymous. They're not synonyms, right? And if it were possible today, I would ask why, in a text that is so thoroughly rigorous on almost every other detail, does this slippage take place? An easy answer is that they are all elements of a broader reader, but this is not Ismail's argument. I suggest that in a very serious way, this book is about teaching reading, a pedagogy in the old sense of the one who walks the scholar to and from school. Particularly, it is about teaching reading from a point of view, a reading that might be adequate to our conjuncture. What concerns Kadri in this text is the movement of an episteme. It is an episteme that, in producing the frame for guaranteeing the ascendancy of dead white men, produced rigorously the black man as waste, all the while shifting shape, full circle from, and these are the constellations that he reads, culture, race, nature, to society, nature, by way of imagination / imitation, culture, cultures, and finally to race, cultures. So go from culture to culture, ultimately. These terms signify the edges of difference that Kadri reads and helps us to grasp more clearly how the colonial was structured epistemically to produce race, and how this is maintained in our present through the humanities. As he at one point phrases it, this book argues that culture emerged at the intersection of Tyler Arnold, concatenated with race, in response to a colonial solicitation, not to produce knowledge, if there is such a thing, but accomplished by disciplinary reason, to abet interpolation of the other and the subject. To be too blunt, this book is to demonstrate that we don't have culture, as Kadri phrases it, culture has us. Whereas Mbembe's intervention moves at speed and Chandler is at pains to expound the theoretical force of Du Bois, Ismail's intervention unfolds through a close reading of semantiques, small units of meaning, as these disclose the undercurrents of the text. In following the itinerary of culture, Kadri notes that, unlike society, culture enables the argument that colonialism, a political epistemological imposition, violence, does not follow an exclusively political or economic and exploitative, but another imperative for which a name must be found. An imperative that benefits, improves the object of culture, whether savage or barbarian, would make her subject, bring her closer to the fully or properly human. Kadri is reading the founding texts of English anthropology and sociology, examining when and how the concept of culture enters the English language. The point here is not about origin, but necessity. It's not simply to know the provenance of a concept, but rather to read the contours that might disclose why such a concept gets named then, in that conjuncture. It is this necessity that Kadri names as Eurocentrism. At a certain point, he argues, it became necessary for colonialism to be transformed from a capitalist enterprise to a liberal one. The reason for this transformation, as both Mbembe and Chandler intimated, and to paraphrase Fanon, is white anxiety about attaining the rank of man. The post-colonial reader, in Kadri's argument, does not simply read for a historical trajectory. Rather, such a reader needs to pay attention to actual language, not value judgment. It is not simply that culture displaces nature, is pluralized through imagination, and relativized to deal with race, in other words, to keep its effect in play while postponing its racial touch. Rather, in each juncture, the disciplinary reason of the humanities produces such a shift through producing the black man, whether Irish or African, as not white, while the European is produced as white, to riff off of Dada as Q does. As Kadri shows, repeatedly, these discursive moods do not hold, not even a little bit. And while it may cause the post-colonial reader to, and I quote, pour himself a scotch in the gotcha moment, it does not displace the system itself. If culture is the domain of anthropology and sociology, imagination, no doubt, is the domain of literature and the aesthetic. Imagination, as a concept, emerges at a moment where the native has culture, but not quite like the European due to a lack of futurity. Okay, so where was I? Imagination, as a concept, emerges at a moment where the native has culture, but not quite like the European due to a lack of futurity. Only the white European, according to the literary figures like Shelley, apparently, has the capacity to imagine the future. The native only imitates. In a term that might give the trend to poor theory a pause, the native does clearly imagine, but poorly. This intervention is not anti-anthropology, although it certainly disparages those who stake a claim to cultural relativism. Even the most ardent relativist, as Kadri reminds us, will exercise evaluation under certain conditions, but rather seeks to disclose how the humanities is complicit with perpetuating the difference of the Anglo-US episteme, demonstrating through a close reading of Williams's inability to violate disciplinary sanctity, how keeping the disciplines of English literature and anthropology apart enabled the emergent field of cultural studies to maintain this epistemic formation. As such, Kadri suggests that the anthropological concept of culture has an itinerary, one that intersects with literature and, even in the relativist instance, is Eurocentric. If Mbembe and Chandler's indictments of cultural relativism weren't enough, Kadri points out through reading figures like Boas, Fletcher, and Geertz that cultural relativism projects difference while staging itself as discovering, observing, describing, or for that matter, interpreting, writing it, with the disciplinary mechanism of the field as its compass. Culture, it should be clear in my short reading of Kadri's text, is then a hook, a clinomen that allows the condition of Eurocentrism to become established, a condition that in turn hinges on the production of another condition, that of blackness. This is why in his final chapter, Kadri insists the target of critique should not be the simple racism of the system of black reason. It should not equally, if not quite as straightforwardly, be the marker of the difference of the system as this weighs on the black body, but should rather be the epistemic formation that makes this possible. Of course, as the tone of his text makes clear, it is also always all of these at the same time. Where then does this leave the post-colonial? Reading the edges of our conjunctures, disclosing the mechanisms of our subjectivations in a politically scrupulous way, and unsettling the episteme at the core of its own conjunctures. Calling for finishing the critique of dead white men, here, there, everywhere. It must refuse the easy roots of cultural and relativized difference. It should read and teach reading so as to open space for futures that are not yet and cannot be imagined. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurits. I think there's a very good argument for you represent the paper as it goes along. I think you kind of raising a set of questions that ask for South African, the kind of specificities of the South African kind of experience to be thought across different kinds of epistemic assumptions that that I hear you saying the humanities, that makes the humanities complicit in a certain kind of violence, but it isn't where we've diagnosed it to be. And if that's true, if you can speak a little bit more about reading as a practice, or perhaps even as a kind of a praxis that has bearing on imagining the unimagined future, I think you'll take us into the realm of your own argument. In other words, I think helpfully reading Fanon, helpfully reading Mbembe, Chandler, and Kadri Ismail to get to what you want to say. And so if you could, you're wagering a lot on your reading of what that constellation of thinkers is saying. What would you wager on your kind of écriture, your writing, your committing as an author to a concept of reading that is demanding a different orientation of the senses or of the and of the question, I guess, if that makes sense.
I guess I wanted to linger a little bit on some of your terms and just invite you to say a bit more. I guess one of them is already there in the title, and I'm thinking about whither. And I get clearly the sense in which you are activating, the process of, degeneration, desecration, disintegration. You're getting that, and also, of course, orientation, where, telos, etc. Of course, I suppose in terms of the political traditions that you're drawing up out of Hegel, for example, Whither has that strong sense too of the fate of the state, especially, of course, in certain aspects of Western Marxism. Part of that has to do with inheriting from Hegel that notion that there is a kind of process underway that human intervention has little to contribute to. The state will wither not necessarily because of political action, but there's something understood to be present within historicity as such that will produce the withering of the state. So there's something there about fate that feels like it needs a little bit more attention in what you've presented here, especially having drawn attention to the richness of Whither. The other thing I'm thinking about, well, two things, but I'll try to be short. I learned my lesson this morning. I wondered about the figure of the line. You pick up very nicely on what Chandler is trying to do with that. I don't know whether you know Jennifer Lynn Stover. She's got a little book called The Sonic Color Line. One of the things that she's trying to get us to think about is the way that line has this quite rich and ambiguous quality to it. Because of course, as an icon, it has no referent, because there is no line that the sign of a line refers to. She's also interested in line in the sense of tendency, right? Political line. And it strikes me that there would be interesting things to do with what's happening to the notion of line under the pressure of the kinds of mobilizations of différance that you're very interested in. Lastly, on imagination. I guess one of the things that I never really fully agreed with in my many conversations with Kadri about this is the sense that imagination was a kind of an adequate capture for the aesthetic. And he needs that pretty badly in that discussion because that's his way of getting reading attached to certain kind of a hermeneutical problematic. But it strikes me that there probably is an important aspect of the problematic that he's after that might also recognize the extent to which imagination mattered, for example, to a thinker like Darwin, who is in very odd and interesting ways kind of putting back to work some of these very archaic traditions of spiritualism and animism, and the notion that we are not just capable of engaging animals, we are with them. We form company with them. And it strikes me that that's not exactly aesthetic, and it's not exactly philosophical in the way that, you know, Hume and others worried about imagination as bringing back the past. It touches on this idea of the past asserting itself quite independently of our wills. Anyways, these really aren't, and I apologize, they really aren't straightforward questions, but they are issues that you've raised, at least for me, and I'm very grateful for it. Thanks.
So the question mark, I actually thought about that for a long time, if I should put the question mark into my title, or if it should be like whether the post-colonial or whether the post-colonial. I mean, I do think that there is something there in the Foucault quote, which I need to look at more closely, which I got it ready for next one. Which helps actually in thinking, you know, Fanon's perpetual questioning. I mean, I would have to sit with it more to be able to answer you more fully, Lwando, but it's a nudge in the direction. You know, I think Fanon has a lot in common with someone like Foucault, actually, even though Foucault's anti-psychiatry is what everyone remembers him for. John is trying not to laugh while I make that comment. So yeah, I mean, so I decided to make of the title a question, both of where does post-coloniality go? Is post-coloniality withering? But also the question of what it means to be between problem and critique, right? So looking at these two very different figures in what we might call Black thought, signaled by Chandler and Mbembe in this case. And that at that level, it was a false question, because I mean, I hope it's clear in the iterations I moved through in my paper that I'm not saying we need to choose between Mbembe or Chandler or Kadri. Even though some of them might need to slow down in their reading, in my estimation. I can say that because he's not in this room. So, Heidi, what is the wager of committing to reading? Reading as a practice, you know, that I mean, I guess my argument is that you know, I mean, I encountered this repeatedly when I was working on my dissertation, Kadri would ask me, how is this literature? And my argument was, it's reading. If literature is the reading of problems, then reading problems is literature, which is maybe not a satisfactory response, although Kadri was sympathetic. I think that what I'm suggesting, obviously reading is not just about the words on a page. You also read a social, and you read a performance, and you read an engagement. So reading is not just textual, but there is something about the textuality of reading that I guess I'm suggesting seeps into all of those instances. And what we find now, at least I find, is that people don't read, right? People get tweet-sized quotes of what people have said, and that passes as thought. I'm making myself sound like an old man, but I think there is something to do about actually teaching people how to read, and how to read in a way that you can disclose an epistemic structure. That is what I see at work in the writings of someone like Biko, for example, or even in some cases, the musings of someone like Sobukwe. And those are, I mean, so this goes away from my paper now, but that's what you were asking me in a sense, is that, if you think of how Sobukwe talks about the concept of Africa, for example, and the way that he poses that as a pedagogy for what it might mean to be African in a world that needs to come after the violence of colonialism. I think there's something in that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's how I'm answering your question. John, yeah. Thanks. I do, yeah. I mean, so firstly, obviously, the thing to say is thank you, and yes, I will think these three as I revise and work on this paper. Around Whither, I'm glad that the multiple ways in which I was using it actually came through. I wasn't sure if I should make that more explicit, but I think it works if you heard it, so that's good. The withering of the state is it's interesting because it's what's going to happen, but it's also, as we know from very close neighbors to South Africa, or even your home country, I guess we could call it, that the withering of the state is also something that enables fascism. And so I guess it's on the, I haven't thought about it in relation to this paper at all, and I will, if only to bracket it again later. but yeah, I mean, I don't have more I can say about that, John. Maybe others in the room have something to add in on it. In terms of the sonic color line, I need to read about it because I'm not familiar with her work, but I'm very taken by this idea of line as tendency. Also because it gets at the way in Chandler's reading of Du Bois, which I should disclose. Kadri once said to me, "There's nothing interesting in Chandler about Du Bois." And I said, "I'm not sure that you're being entirely fair. I think Chandler might have been a little too close to Kadri at that point in terms of what they were saying about Du Bois. But the point is that the tendency, firstly, to read Du Bois as an African Americanist, right? So to read theory out of him, in a sense. But then also, what is the tendency that is made available through abiding by reading the line as a marker for difference, right? And then what if you, so in that sense, I'm hearing in tendency, the other word that we associate with Kadri, which is abide. I think that's something to play with for sure. Imagination. I mean, I see where you're going. What if the animal responded? I mean, I think for Kadri, imagination needs to be how he characterizes it for his argument to work. But you know, if you think of the role in, say, the aesthetics of the sublime in Kant, I mean, that's impossible without imagination, right? I mean, what allows you to have sublime reason is imagination, not actually being on the seashore in front of the storm, right? So it captures a certain form of the aesthetic. I mean, I do think that he marshals a very particular line in order to make a point. And I think his point is not so much that imagination is bad. I think his point is more that there's no discipline in the humanities that can escape this problem of what he calls Eurocentrism. And I think, you know, and I think that is something that's important to hold on to in this argument, that the humanities itself, as a formation of disciplines, produces Eurocentrism in its kind of disciplinary reason.
So thank you, Maurits, for the presentation. I would like to ask whether the framework Mbembe provides, fixated on the mutually complicit nature of the native and colonizer alike, since both are engaged in a collective economy of desire, can support the possibility of liberty through an account of reading or translation, perhaps, as Diagne maybe would argue. And the idea is that, you know, Diagne talks about reading as a kind of pleasure, that people who engage in literacy, in writing, and communicating information are engaged in this kind of pleasurable transfer of information. So perhaps can that support that idea, given that in Mbembe's account of Critique of Black Reason, he argues that both the colonizer and the native were kind of complicit in this economy where there was this object of desire in the center being the fetish, right? And to go further than that, in this very claim that is perhaps being made, I'm sorry, I've pressed it on my camera, so you know that's just security reasons. So I was trying to get it off when I can't. I feel a bit rude, but okay. So yes, built into the very claim is not the idea of like the illiterate, the conscientious objector to reading, perhaps, or the griot, you know, who all hold their own specific epistemic commitments to alternative frameworks. If we grant that knowledge democracy, the concept in sociology holds, that they just become simply collateral damage towards epistemic progress. So I just made like a proviso to that. Like, so in other words, to return to Spivak's notion of the subaltern, what are the other accounts of readings, you know, readings in plurality that can provide value to particular epistemic authorities without perhaps regressing into a notion of relativism of those who do not have access to the internet or to reading materials or to the networks of knowledge accessibility, but who do produce different forms of what maybe De Sousa Santos might call epistemologies of the South, or vectors from below, if we follow Ian Hucking's constructivist notion of social kinds coming into being through the creation of people that are perhaps outside of the purview of the dominant structures of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Two vantage points. The first one is one of your opening lines about reading in someone's eyes, which in personal context suddenly makes possible again. The second, of course, from Heidi's point of view, the wager of a commitment to reading and what that actually looks like. And the third one, from a very pedagogical point of view of the reading group and its particular discipline, if not disciplinary reason, and the classroom, all of which I want to pose against your evocation of the tweet, new technologies, and the space we find ourselves in now, where reading is not just text or book or the social or all the other wonderful versions of which you gave, but which has suddenly become fragmented. Fragmented at the same time as it's become proliferated, as it's become digitized, universalized, distanced, and all of those things. And the new technologies, in a sense, sort of weaponize the fragment. What does that do to a reading from a point of view, to a disciplined, a slow, a close reading, a reading that allows you to look up and imagine?
I want to take the opportunity to pick up a few stories and to, if I may, and to also remember some fragments of Padre Ismail as I do so. And the first one is obviously consistent, deliberate, and his perpetual critique of the ethno. I mean, if there was one scholar who had absolutely no truck with the ethno, anything, that was Kadri Ismail. But Kadri Ismail was also inconsistent, often around questions of race. And some of you will remember a very famous Leader School drunken debate around race, and that was around Gary Minkley and who was a white person and whether Maurits was a white person, and how and all of the fissures and the contradictions of whiteness and blackness as we try and think those categories politically and outside of race as they produced in South Africa, as they produced the notions of producing in the United States and so on. Now this was 10 years ago, 12 years ago or so, and we moved on quite considerably around questions of race, and where the spaces for a politicized concept of race, even on the left, are probably closing down. And where you have a rehabilitation of racialized and even ethnicized concepts of race. So if it is that an anti-racist idea of race is a peculiarly South African one that can also be seen in some of the literatures, the scholarship that you will involve. To what extent is it possible to argue against and fight against that closing down of a re-racialized concept of blackness?
I suppose, I also want to ask the question, and I'm really grateful for the gesture and the tribute to Padre. I mean, Maurits and I both studied with Padre, and it was a persistent time of questioning, to rethink the problematic of race in more refined and difficult ways as we proceeded in our kind of encounters with you. I wanted to ask about the stakes of futurity. Because in a sense, when one thinks about Mbembe and what he's given the global discourse on race is a concept of futurity. And yet it's a fairly truncated, I think that's where the question of reading and your worry about the haste with which Mbembe proceeds, I haven't read Chandler, is the worry with worry about how quickly he wants to get to the question of futurity without realizing that the future might already be colonized. And so the question I want to ask you to think about reading in relation to the question of techne and what you're proposing, because it seems to me that the question of techne is not resolved. And that were we to do what Siraj is asking us to do, is to deconstitute race, then we might want to think about what investments we have in the question of reading as a technique.
The only thing I just wanted to add very, very briefly is you know, it's important to recognize I'm not sure quite what the right word is, but the attitude toward Eurocentrism is in Kadri's project. I think one of the things that he repeats sometimes cantankerously, yes, you know, is this notion that it's not like we're going to get out of it or around it. If it's as much of a problem as he's trying to convince us it is, then it really is about how you work there. That's all.
Fantastic. Okay. Wow, where to go? So let me start with Helena. I haven't forgotten you, Harry. I will get back to your question. But so Helena, I need to talk to you with my back to you, I'm afraid. I think unless I can do that. Can you hear me? Okay. So I mean, so the first thing to say about the tweet is that I don't think it's a new form of reading or engagement. It's what grad students in the US have done. I mean, they were doing it when I was there. You know, you read the first few pages, you read somewhere in the middle, and you read at the end, and then you act like you've read a book, which is basically what of course, I never did that. No, so that's the flippant response. I mean, the weaponized fragment is, I think, an interesting idea. It's, of course, what it brings to my mind is the formulation from M.A. Césaire, where he talks about, you know, the miraculous weapon of poetry, which is to produce chippings, fragments of the world, and kind of set them loose and see what disruption they produce in a project to explode the French language. That's his project, in a sense. And Césaire is someone who is read repeatedly through in Mbembe's. He's one of the people that Mbembe actually reads in his book. Which is to say that the tweet isn't just something to be disregarded, right? It can be used effectively. I mean, potentially as a weaponized fragment. So just to hold that in mind, I'm not trying to just say, oh, we have to only do a certain kind of read. Well, only do a certain kind. We must do a certain kind of reading. And this comes to your question around the reading group and the classroom. Now, my university recently told me very bluntly that the reading group is not a classroom and doesn't count as teaching within a university, which is an interesting line to take. So there is something about gathering people together in a project of reading closely, which attempts to be a non-hierarchical space, but always has a certain hierarchy embedded in it, right? Which I think is which is what the CHR at least puts forward as a example of pedagogy, right? I'm not sure where I was going with that. My brain is fried. Where was I going with that? So I don't think the reading group is the classroom, is I guess the point I'm trying to make.
This is the official one.
No, I think because you have a capacity to engage with the text that is not instructional, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. And we can keep having these conversations over dinner because I'm not doing justice to them. Harry. Sure. I mean, Harry, you raise a few very important questions. And obviously there are multiple modes of reading and engagement outside of the text that I'm dealing with. And So one response is to say that, you know, I'm an academic, not an activist. And I don't mean that flippantly. I mean that there are spaces in society that people inhabit and they produce discourse, and I will read that, but from where I'm located. It's that sense of the conjuncture that Mbembe puts forward in his book. Although I would say, you know, that we need to be careful about, just as John was saying about the imagination in Kadri, I left it implicit in my reading of Mbembe, but, well, relatively implicit, but, you know, the transatlantic slave trade isn't the totality of colonial experience, right? It's become emblematic, but there are a lot of people who were colonized who do not share that kind of historical trauma. And I think that's worth remembering, that the complicity that he talks about and then generalizes as a condition of the colonial and of Blackness is a particular condition, right? And so there is a purchase, I guess, to use a very terrible metaphor, given we're talking about neoliberal economy in Mbembe, but there is a purchase to the concept that he's trying to deploy, I guess. So it's a strategic use. So Harry, I guess what I'm saying is that I'm not sure about the pleasure of reading in Bashir Jan. Although Jan is, as you know, someone who is in the background of a lot of my thinking around the aesthetic and African art as philosophy, right? But I would need to attend to, I haven't read Jan's, you're talking about the Ink of the Scholars, yeah? I think. Yeah. So I mean, I'll need to think through that one a little bit more carefully. But if you remember the beginning of that book, he responds to the question that Untunji asks him about, if you were located in Africa, would you have given a different reading of Descartes? And he talks about how the audience reads that the same way, I guess, as Chandler says, people read Du Bois as dealing with race. But actually, Untunji is dealing with a much more careful question of conjuncture, which is not context and not relativized difference. And so Bashir Jan starts the book by producing that argument, which I think would be, like, resonates with what we're just talking about here. You know, Siraj, in the midst of that debate, I opened my mouth and Kadri said, "Shut the fuck up, Maurits." And I might just take my cue from him again. No, but I think you're right, and that space is closing. And I do think that there is a need to hold that space open, and it's a concern that structures Mbembe's intervention, Chandler's intervention, Kadri's intervention, right? Your work, Premesh's work, you know, it's a concern that a lot of us hold, and you know, Sorote's latest poem is about precisely trying to hold that space open. And I guess I don't know, you know, I don't know how, if it will work, but you need to venture it in any case. You need to, in a sense, as John was raising, there needs to be you need to have a tendency along that line in a way, right, to try open it. I'm not sure that it's achievable now, but you still need to venture it, I think. I mean, the re-racialized concept of Blackness is what is, you know, it's even your question is even a concern of someone like Olela Mantu, you know, who says in his book on Biko, anyone who thinks that what Biko meant by blackness was race has not understood a word Biko has ever said. He proceeds to then write a book about Biko making blackness into race. But he still is aware that this is not what that project was about. So I guess it's mobilizing those fragments in a way to set them loose in the social and see where they land. I'm not sure what else we can do. Talking about the stakes of futurity, Premesh, and John's reminder about Eurocentrism, so I'm trying to not have my back to people all the time, but in a certain way, it's the image that Deleuze and Guattari give us in the introduction to Anti-Oedipus, where they say this is the furniture in the room that we're perpetually moving around, right? The question is if that movement, moving around, can take part of a little bit of what in my book, as you know, you've just read my introduction again, is calling invention, right? If there is something that might, if there is a inventive quality in there that might introduce, as Kadri says it in his book, a difference into the repetition, right? And that difference might be important. It's not a case of as John reminded us with Kadri, it's not a case of exiting the script, but it might be a case of ending the European game, which is a conversation Hugh and I had many, many times about whether or not that act of shifting the furniture is something that might in itself be a violation of Eurocentrism in a way. So you can violate it while you play it. The only way to win the game is by cheating in a way, although you don't win, but you understand the point. Especially if you're an Australian cricketer, I should say, but just for Kadri's sake.